this video, we'll broadly consider what is a questionnaire and why we should use it, the advantages and disadvantages of using questionnaires, and we'll explore how to design a good questionnaire. So let's start with some basics. A questionnaire is any kind of list of questions that we can use for data collection. And in this sense, it's the same set of questions that are asked in the same order with the same wording, so that the same kind of information can be gathered across a number of different participants. It differs from a survey because a survey is a method of measuring opinions, experiences, and other phenomena, and a questionnaire can often be a tool used as a survey within a survey. But a survey can mean also other things. So questionnaires are generally administered in different ways. For example, it could be that you ask in a structured way and formal way by an interviewer. So there's a face-to-face interaction where the interviewer reads out the questions in the same order and the same wording. In this case, there's obviously a bias that needs to be considered, because the interviewer could potentially introduce an intonation, a pause that makes the question be interpreted in a particular way. But it also has the advantage of making sure that the participants are filling out the questionnaire appropriately, because the interviewer is there to assist them and answer any particular questions if a question is ambiguous, for example, or the participant is confused. Other ways are more generally led by the participant themselves, so they fill out the questionnaire. And this can happen in 4 main ways. One is through a postal questionnaire. So you write out your questionnaire, you send it out via mail, and give participants like an envelope with a stamp, and they can fill it out and send it back to you by the deadline you've given them. Or you could have a telephone questionnaire whereby you phone up different participants and ask the questions over the phone. Similarly, you can do it via email. But probably one of the most common ways of distributing questionnaires is online. So why do we use questionnaires? Why would you pick this method for your research? They're generally used, unlike qualitative research or more ethnographic research, they're used for making generalizations, and therefore they need to be based on a very carefully selected sample. So your sampling techniques here are crucial to make sure that you are finding a representative enough sample of the population from which you can draw these generalizations. And these generalizations can be around trying to find out about frequencies or patterns in behaviors and opinions, people's expectations or preferences, any particular trends, so looking at how things might change over time, or shifts in opinion, for example. There's obviously lots of different advantages to questionnaires. I think the main kind of advantage is that it allows for a large amount of information to be collected from a large number of people in a very short period of time, and it's relatively cost effective. If you are not delivering the questionnaire in person or over the and it's maybe through postal questionnaires or email or online questionnaires, this allows also for participants to have more time to think about their answers, and they don't have to necessarily reply immediately. It's also something that people are generally familiar with. You will have undoubtedly filled out at least one questionnaire in your life, most likely several. There might be situations when, depending on the topic, having a questionnaire is perhaps more appropriate, because if a participant feels that the topic is too sensitive, they might not feel comfortable opening up if you, for example, were to use an interview method. Whereas in a questionnaire, it feels more perhaps anonymous, depending on how it's set up. But there's less of that kind of face-to-face interaction that might create a barrier. And then obviously it allows to quantify responses and then compare and contrast between different participants or changes over time. However, there are also all sorts of disadvantages to questionnaires, so you need to be careful as to deciding whether this is the best method for your research question. So you might find that depending on how you've distributed your questionnaire, only people who are interested will actually reply, and therefore that is kind of skewing already. There's a self-selection bias in who is answering your questionnaire. People might also ignore certain questions, or they might feel fatigued by questionnaires if they're filling out too many, or you, for example, if you're doing like a repeated measures and you're asking people to fill it out at certain intervals, if that's too frequent, people might lose interest and drop out. Depending on the format that you pick, whether it's postal, email, telephone, or whatnot, some formats might not be suitable or accessible to every single participant. So think about who is your population, what percentage of that population might have disabilities, but more generally think about how can you make your questionnaire accessible to as many people as possible. And this kind of applies to any kind of method, actually. One of the main issues with questionnaires, especially if it's not administered by a person, is that there's a risk that respondents will read into questions very differently from one another, and they will have their own interpretation of the question. So what someone might think is good, someone else might feel that is poor, and there's very much a level of subjectivity that is not acknowledged and doesn't necessarily come through in the answers of the questionnaire. And similarly, there's also a level of researcher imposition. So when you are developing the questionnaire, the researcher generally makes their own decisions and has their own assumptions as to what is important and what is not important, and therefore should or should not be included. So it might be that actually, depending on the researcher's imposition, you might be missing out on having included particular questions that the participant would like to answer but are not available in the questionnaire. There's also no way of knowing how much a participant is putting thought into their answer. They might be skimming quite quickly through the questions. This is especially true if you're giving them some sort of incentive, or if they're doing it to help you out, but they don't really care. They might just click through and not put a lot of effort, which obviously will skew the kind of answers that you get. So you might think that actually making a questionnaire is not that hard, and it's just a matter of like thinking about some questions and then sending them out. It's actually a really hard task. So much so that this is more as a joke, but if you go on Twitter, there's this Twitter page which is collecting and crowdsourcing all sorts of examples of bad survey questions. And it might be interesting to have a look through these just as a way of thinking about what should you be avoiding when you're developing a questionnaire. And it's not just inexperienced people who've never developed a questionnaire previously who might struggle to develop one and make one. It's also people who do this potentially as a job or part of their political campaign, for example. So this is a real life example from an opinion poll that the Trump campaign for his presidency candidacy for 2020 sent out via Twitter in early March 2020 as a result of the Super Tuesday exit poll. And you might notice that this is something that candidates tend to do just to get a sense of what are people's opinions, why are they voting for certain candidates or not. And the very first questions you see here is which do you identify as, an American or a socialist? You scroll down a bit further, the third question is, what are your views on crazy Bernie Sanders? Now, regardless of what you think about Trump or US politics, what we see here is that this questionnaire, is very much skewed to gather a particular type of information, and it's not really allowing respondents to give necessarily an honest answer. American and socialist are not two mutually exclusive categories, and yet they're being treated as such in the very first question. So this is why the design process of a questionnaire is really, really important, because if you're setting out yourself to answer a research question, you want to make sure that you've collected the most accurate, reliable, unbiased data that you possibly can. And there's 7 stages to questionnaire design process. The first one is you need to be able to determine what is it that you want to find out. So sometimes surveys are carried out as a matter of routine. For example, you might have an annual user survey. Others take place as a one-off questionnaire and often serve on a particular topic. But you need to have your research question, your topic area well defined before you start thinking about a questionnaire. Once you've got that, you then need to think about who your audience is, who's going to be your sample, how are you going to recruit them. You might, for example, be aiming to send out a questionnaire to students or library staff or academic staff, and therefore it might be appropriate to target one or more of these groups. You might want to think about, is it just part-time students, full-time students, first-year students, staff in a particular department? And again, you might think about selecting a random sample or not. Then you need to start thinking about the format of your data collection. So how are you going to be collecting that data? What type of questionnaire you're going to be using? Then once you have the format, then you actually start constructing the questionnaire and the various components of it, considering the content, wording, format, structure, the layout, and then most importantly, piloting it. Once you've piloted it and you've seen, yes, it works, or made tweaks and improvements depending on what is needed, you then send it out to collect your responses. And at this stage, you need to make sure that you are maximizing the number of responses you receive, but also chasing potential non-respondents. And then it's time to analyze it and write it up. So the trickiest stages are these kind of 3 central steps. And that's what we will be focusing on in today's video. So when it comes to the format of your data collection, we've talked about postal, telephone, digital, or in-person survey. And this table kind of shows some of the criteria or comparison metrics that you can have between the 4 types of questionnaires. So think about, what is it that you want to be prioritizing? Do you, for example, need to collect answers really quickly? In which case, using a telephone questionnaire or a digital questionnaire is a lot quicker than sending out something via the post or having it in person. Or if you want to prioritize anonymous data collection, then postal responses and digital responses can be the best option. Or if you really care about detailed questions and getting particular answers, then having a telephone or in-person questionnaire might be better. I would argue here that if that's the case, though, you might want to consider having something that's more qualitative, perhaps, and question whether something like an interview might instead be more appropriate. But in this day and age, one of the most common forms of data collection is perhaps a digital survey, or a digital questionnaire, sorry. And some of the advantages is that it's basically, you can send them out relatively swiftly. The turnaround is really quick. It's very low cost. You don't have to transcribe your answers. So if you got them on, for example, via post, you then have to digitize your responses. This is done automatically through whatever tool you're using. And it also facilitates analysis and makes it a lot quicker. One of the issues, though, you need to consider is, again, in relation to your sample, is who is it excluding if you are doing a digital questionnaire? Are you excluding people who are perhaps less tech savvy? Are those people important for your sample? You might still get low response rate. And depending on how it's set up, you might find that the same person might respond more than once. And again, depending on how it's set up and what tools you've used, it might be unclear as to whether you can tell if the same person has answered or not. There's several tools that you can use. Northumbria has access to online surveys, and in order to get an account for it, you need to email IT services and ask to be granted access to it so that you can collect data through that system. There are other services that are free or have a premium paid for option, such as Qualtrics, SurveyMonkey, or Opinio. Of course, there's all sorts of others, so you might want to investigate, depending on the features and the format that you're planning to collect, which is the best tool for your needs. So once you've picked the format of your data collection, you start to think about drafting it. And before you draft it, you need to not just have an idea of what the topic that you're looking at is, but really research what is it about that topic that you want to know. What do we already know about that topic? What is still unknown? So this is where you need to read a lot of papers, read through the literature. You might even do some preliminary research. You might do some interviews or observations to get a sense from a smaller sample of people's experiences, and then use the questionnaire to collect a much larger sample and then generalize those findings. So the very first thing, once you've selected the format of data collection, is not to sit down and write down all the questions you can think about. It's actually to research your topic. in more detail. Then you can start thinking about the questions. And at this stage, you need to think about what is the best format of questions that you should be using. So here I've shown 3 types of questions: open, closed, and scaled. Open questions are very good for allowing participants to have free expression. They can just write, they have free text box. It's useful if you're interested in something that's more exploratory, where we don't know much about the topic and you want to know about people's opinions more in detail. But it can lead to what is called anecdotal evidence. So you might find that a single participant will give you an insight, and there's no way for you to know how widespread that particular experience is, because you've not directly asked about that. And that can be useful. It can provide interesting quotes to then include in your write-up. But it also requires participants to spend some time writing up their answers. And again, this can then feed into that questionnaire fatigue of, if it takes too long to reply to a questionnaire and fill it out, I might not be bothered and drop out if I'm a participant. Closed questions are comparably a lot easier and less time consuming, both to complete but also to analyze. And you can more easily compare the answers between the same question across different participants. And because they're quicker, obviously, people will find it less annoying to fill these out. But you need to be very careful about how you phrase these questions, because you might accidentally lead the respondent into a particular answer. And you need to make sure that the options you give them are actually mutually exclusive. So if we think back at Trump's questionnaire, this one, American and socialist are not necessarily mutually exclusive. And obviously this is biasing the response from the participants. And then the final type of question is scaled questions. There are different types of scaled questions that you can use. They're often referred to as Likert scales. They can be easy to analyze, and they can be used for investigating sensitive topics, for example. But there is a high risk of them being misinterpreted from participants. There's also a risk that if you use a Likert scale, what someone interprets as the distance between the different points is not necessarily consistent between all participants. So, especially if you use categorical or qualitative data like not at all or extremely or somewhat. So this is something to be careful of. So again, when thinking about how you formulate the questions, there are some kind of best practice rule of thumbs that we should follow. Most obvious one is you avoid leading questions, such as the ones that were used in the Trump poll, or other examples like, do you agree that, how good is, those are examples of leading questions. To make them not leading, you would say, what did you think of X? Perhaps something you could use a Likert scale for the agreement to say, how much do you agree with the following statement? And then you might have different points to say, completely disagree, somewhat disagree, neither agree or disagree, somewhat agree, and then agree. One final point, going quickly back to scaled questions, what you want to make sure you do is that you always have negative, the negative side of the scale on the left-hand side and the positive side of the scale at the right-hand side. And that should be consistent throughout all questions. You shouldn't swap between the two. And that's because that's how participants are expecting those questions to be laid out based on previous experiences in filling out questionnaires. Another best practice is that you want to avoid questions in the negative. So always try to formulate your question using positive terms. So not using, for example, marijuana should not be decriminalized, agree or disagree. That question should be changed to marijuana should be criminalized, agree or disagree, because it's a lot easier for participants to understand and make sure that there is no misunderstanding. If you are asking participants about a particular topic, you want to make sure that they are aware of that topic. And this is where researcher's assumption or bias might come in. You might think that because you're an expert or you've read lots about a particular topic, you might assume that your respondents will know as much as well. So in the example on the slide, it's saying, do you agree with the government's policy on Brexit? This assumes that your respondents will know about Brexit. Now, this particular example, if you're sending it out to the UK population, it might be that the majority of people are aware of Brexit in 2020, but if you send it out in a different country, for example, they might not be as aware. Or, for example, if you ask people about their opinion on augmented reality and your sample population is older adults might not know what augmented reality is, so you need to be able to inform them and explain them what that concept is before you ask them questions about it. And then more importantly, what you have to do is avoid asking any type of information that you don't strictly need an answer for. And this is also to comply with GDPR regulations and data protection. So we should not be collecting data that we don't strictly need for our research. If you're not looking at differences in opinions according to age, for example, you might not want to collect age. It's different if you're collecting age as a way of screening participants to exclude anyone who is above a particular age, for example, or below a particular age, just as a way of double checking. Once you've thought about the question format and you're starting to think about drafting the questions, you need to also think about the wording of your individual questions. So on the left-hand side here, we have an example of a hotel questionnaire that asks you, how do you rate breakfast in our hotel? From 1 to 5, where 1 equals poor and 5 equals good. So on the right-hand side, I've broken down how a participant might go through and read these questions. So they might start thinking about, okay, well, first of all, you might think this is actually an okay question and there's nothing wrong with it. But different people might read it in different ways. So somebody might think about it, okay, should I be including room service too? Does it matter if, say, I've stayed in this hotel for several nights, and some days I've asked breakfast through room service, some days I've gone down to the restaurant. Should I rate these in the same way? Is the hotel interested in knowing how I rate breakfast based on the taste and flavour of the options offered, or is it the choice that I was provided with and the range of foods? Again, if I've stayed there several nights, are they asking me to give an opinion based on an average of all the days I've been there, or just today? And also, participants might be thinking about their previous experiences, both in this hotel or in other hotels. And in that case, they might be very different from one another. And also based on their expectations and how closely these were met. And it's only at that point that then the participant will respond. So if somebody has circled 4 or somebody has circled 5, how that 4 and 5 relate to one another might be very different. And that's because users are generally not passive respondents, and they're actually constantly thinking and interpreting the question. Just to give you another example, so this is a health-related questionnaire where participants were asked, how frequently do you experience these symptoms? And then there was a list of symptoms, and they could pick from 1 to 5 again, where 1 equaled twice a month or less, and 5 equaled several times a day. So in this case, okay. So again, you might not notice you might not question the way this question is formulated, but if we change the answer scale, so now it's still 1 to 5, but 1 equals never, 5 equals more than twice a month. So it's a very different time scale between the scaled answer. If we look at the response rates, we see very different responses. So in the first case, 62% of patients reported experiencing the symptoms more than twice a month. So because if somebody never experienced a particular symptom, they would obviously, their only option was to select 1. But if somebody did experience it twice a month or less, they would still be selecting 1. And there'd be no way of distinguishing between the two types of populations. And that's why over half of the participants and patients experienced some symptoms to a certain frequency. By shifting the timescale, only 39% of patients reported experiencing symptoms more than twice a month. Now that's a very different response rate, and that's why the wording and the answer options that you give people are incredibly important to make sure that you're collecting accurate data. Another type of best practice when wording questions is thinking about avoiding double-barreled questions. So take these 2 examples. You have, is your key worker caring and supportive? This is a double-barreled question because it's asking in the same question whether somebody is both caring and supportive. And again, they might be caring but not supportive, or vice versa. So that question should be replaced with, is your key worker caring? Is your key worker supportive? Split it into 2. Similarly, the next one is, are non-parents more likely than parents to support all physical punishments of children by parents being made illegal? This is a very convoluted, complex question that needs to be broken down. So one way of doing it is by having, again, 2 questions. First one is, are you a parent? Yes or no? And 2, should all physical punishments of children by parents be made illegal? And then you can basically compare the answers of those who are parents and those who are not parents and see. Or you could just have question 2 here and send it to a sample of parents and non-parents. And then question 1 just becomes a screening question. The next part in drafting a questionnaire is thinking about the layout. So this is an example of a digital questionnaire, and I'll go with this because it's generally the most common one and more practical to disseminate. So you want to start off with a landing page, one that has a title. So this was a project I did a few years back in collaboration with UCL, and it was about some workshop evaluations. So there's a landing page with a title and a very short brief information. When clicking on the next button here, you get taken to an information sheet and contact details. So in this page, I'm providing participants with details about what the evaluation is about, whether they have to take part or not, what are the advantages, and you can scroll down and see different questions as part of the information sheet. And then at the very bottom, I've included name and contact details of the researchers, the ethical approval number, and making sure that they've read and understood the information sheet, asking them specific approval, that confirmation that they have understood. At that stage, it sends them to the consent form. So we've still not reached the questionnaire part of the questionnaire with all the questions, right? So again, this is to comply with the GDPR regulation. And we need to make sure that participants are agreeing to every single item in our consent form. So this is a long list of different items. So for example, I confirm that I have read and understood the previous information sheet. I consent to participate in the study. I agree to share my name with the researchers, etc. And it goes on until they select each one and then press the next button, and that is the equivalent of receiving consent in a digital format. Only at this stage are they presented with the questionnaires, with the questions for your questionnaire. And again, here you need to think about the layout. So you might want to have an introduction or a title section, and then make sure that it's quite clear how they need to answer. And in this particular view, I'm showing you Qualtrics, which is a tool I mentioned earlier, and it has a preview where you can see how questions are laid out on both a computer and a mobile phone. When it comes to layout, again, you want to keep it consistent, so you want to make sure that every page looks similar to one another, but at the same time you want to mix a bit of variations in styles of question, just so that participants don't get too bored in filling it out. You want to clearly differentiate between instructions and the questions. And this is a really important point because participants will often skim read your questionnaire and might miss out crucial information. And that's why having enough white space is also very important. Again, avoid jargon. You need to explain particular concepts or topics if you're going to ask them about their opinion on it. And then one thing that I like to do in a questionnaire, which is another way of kind of counteracting the researchers' assumptions and biases, is to add a question at the end, which is something along the lines of, is there anything that you would like to add? And this gives them an opportunity to fill out any particular detail or information that we have not covered in the questionnaire, but they felt was necessary to share. At this stage, you're still not ready to distribute the questionnaire, you need to pilot it. Just like you would do on test driving a car with dummies, you would want to double check that everything works in the car before giving it out to actual people. You want to make sure that your questionnaire works, is collecting the correct data, people are not misinterpreting your questions, etc. So ask some friends, ask your family to fill out your questionnaire, give you some feedback, and then make any potential revisions you need to do or changes before you distribute it. At that point, that's when you need to start thinking about distributing your questionnaire and maximizing response rate. So think about the timing. By when do you need to have all your answers? When are you distributing and sharing your questionnaire? If you're targeting students, for example, you might want to avoid times such as summer holidays or exam periods, because that's when students are most likely not going to be either checking their emails or very busy. You want to make sure that there is enough information to set out why you're doing this questionnaire, and this needs to come at the beginning of it. Again, we've talked about giving clear instructions on the different questions, and make sure that it basically stands alone, especially if it's a digital questionnaire. You're not there to explain any confusion. You need to make sure that participants can understand it. And then make sure that once they submit their final submit button, there is some sort of sign off or thank you message. And ideally, you would want to add your email address there so that they can get in touch with you if they have any questions. In order to maximize response rate, one of the common strategies is to provide some sort of reward for participants. Depending on your project, you might have funding, so you might give them a voucher. But it can also be as simple as just emphasizing how they are supporting your research, and this is very much appreciated because it will help improve a service or your dissertation or any kind of other aspects. Sometimes even just sending a picture of a cute cat can be a nice enough reward. You also want to be explicit about time commitments. So at the beginning, make sure you tell participants how long roughly it's going to take to fill out the survey. And the shorter this questionnaire, the better. Where possible, try to use an easy response format such as checkboxes, and if people have not been responding to your questionnaire, it is okay to kind of chase them up. Not in a too insisting way, but you can send them 1 or 2 reminders to just fill it out by a certain date.